So today's facilitators are Tatiana Orla, who's staff at Mothers Out Front in New York, and myself, who you have met now many times, the manager of training at Mothers Out Front. Our mission at Mothers Out Front, we build our power as mothers to ensure a livable climate for all children. Next slide. And so here we are, we're on the fourth of this whole series. It's really exciting to be with everybody who's been here throughout or has shown up for some of them. And we're going to dive in today to the topic of group social meeting. A quick recap, this has been our journey so far. So we've talked about base building. Let me just see, anyone want to chat in or speak up and say what is base building? What's the definition of base building for you at this point in the series? Let's see who feels like they have a definition to share. Any definition of base building: growing our membership and community connections to combine our power. Yes. The foundation of good organizing. Yes. Awesome. So I think we've been reviewing this quite a bit. We need to base build, and we need to base build across race and class because we can't do it alone, and we are not powerful enough alone to beat back the fossil fuel industry. So in this series, we've been talking about base building techniques, things like canvassing, tabling, reaching out to centers of community, or using social media. Then on this Tuesday, we had Adelita and Lupita talking to us about the one-on-one conversation, how to go deeper in building those relationships after you've had that first seed that you've planted. And now what's next is, well, what's next is talking about the group meeting, but actually we'd like to give you a chance to do a breakout together today and just someone that you haven't met with, maybe from another chapter. We're going to break you out just into random pairs where you can share your name, team, and state, and either one way you've been base building that you realize now might have been restricting your ability to organize across race and class. Or if you haven't been doing any base building and this was a new concept or one that you needed a refresher on, just name a new idea that you have to work base building into your organizing more regularly. So you should see something pop up pretty soon here to go into your groups for 4 minutes, 2 minutes each.
Okay.
All right, let's go to the next slide. Welcome back, everybody. And we just wanted to give a couple minutes now for anyone who wants to either share what you shared in your group or what your partner shared that you think might be interesting for other people to hear. And feel free to unmute and actually speak in this time.
I think in retrospect, we needed to spend, someone in our team needed to do a one-to-one with the new person, probably before we had our first meeting with them, to for them to get to know us and feel comfortable. And I think that we had a new person come who no one had reached out to beforehand, and she must have felt very uncomfortable and never came again. We never heard from her, period. You live and learn.
Mm-hmm.
This is Rosemary.
Hi, Rosemary.
I wanted to say that I thought it was a really wonderful exercise for this moment. I was paired with Jenny from Boston, Massachusetts. As soon as we saw each other, it was like we knew each other forever. And not just that, is that we knew each other's pain in trying to enlarge our territory and trying to provide and educate around health and safety of our family members and our loved ones. We shared a moment. It was all too brief. I just asked her for her email and phone. And I think that these kind of random pairings of like minds can really be powerful in a moment. So I want to thank the organizers for connecting me with Jenny and for connecting all of us, because if we think about it, something fabulous just happened.
Thank you. We'll move on with that inspirational comment to the next piece here. And I'm glad people had an opportunity to just connect across the different states and connect with like-minded people, like Rosemary said. So we can move to the next slide.
1 minute, Sheila.
So today's agenda quickly is introduction and review. Then we'll go into what is the group meeting and why it's important. 2 examples of culturally responsive group meetings. Then breaking it down, planning your own group meeting. That will be a breakout group. And then full group discussion, and we will finish. And today's training is the shortest of all of them. So we're gonna finish around 9 today. Yay, everyone can go to bed. All right. So after these steps, let me make sure this is still me. After we've gone through planting those seeds through canvassing, tabling, reaching out to centers of community or social media or whatever you're using for your initial outreach, then we've gone deeper with the one-to-one. You know, I just want to hear from you all, chat in a little bit. What do you usually do in your Mothers Out Front team to continue building your base relationships, connecting people, and expanding your team? Because that's what we're going to be talking about today, but I'm curious, what do you do? So let's just chat in for a few minutes here and see what other people are already using. What's that next step for you? Lavanya, she panics a little when I say what time it is on the East Coast. Potluck meetings, okay. Tabling, speaking at chapter meetings, more one-on-ones, invite the interested volunteer to attend a chapter meeting. Bilingual meetings and how to continue the connections. I love tabling. Follow-up calls, that's a good one. Connect people to specific activities depending on their interest. I love that. Reaching out to local churches, having speakers from Mothers Out Front City Council, expert speakers on climate-related topics. All right, these are all, there's so many different ideas here actually. So thank you for sharing those. Social media, reaching out to community groups, tabling. So some of these are the initial seed planning. I do want to point out, like the tabling, that's the initial seed planning. Not that it has to always be in one order, but you know, you're going to meet someone and then you're going to plug them in somehow and get to know them better. So we can go on to the next slide here. Thank you for all of your really awesome ideas, everybody. And then I'm going to pass it off to Tatiana.
Great, thank you, Sheila. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So what is the purpose of group meetings? So at this stage, you've covered, you know, some of the groundwork that you do initially. You have your one-on-ones, you have your kind of smaller interactions to get people interested in Mothers Out Front, and you want to move to having more group meetings and group settings. And so one of the ways that we've traditionally thought of this is the house party, right? You invite people over to your house, you have wine, you have food, you show them a slideshow, and you try to get them engaged. And then you hope that a few of those folks will want to come back. But what we really want to think about is really expanding our idea of what we think the group meeting is, because it doesn't have to look like a house party. It can be a lot of different things. And so we really want to look at what the purpose, if everybody can mute, that would be great. It's a little disruptive. The purpose of the group meeting is really to just continue some of these things that we're doing at all stages of the relationship building process. So we're going to continue to ground truth. So as you get to know people through organizing these group meetings with them or for them, you're going to discover new things about the things that they're passionate about, the issues that concern them in their community, truths about the community in terms of, you know, who the stakeholders are, what the history is, who the power players are. You're going to tap into existing social networks to continue building your base. I think one of the biggest misconceptions we have when we say we're community organizing is that the communities we're going into aren't inherently already organized. Every community is organized. They may not be organized in the way that you recognize or is familiar, but there is some sort of order. There's people who are gatekeepers, there's people who have existing relationships. And as you have more events and you have these group meetings, you're able to discover and unearth more of those that'll help you build the right kind of relationships and build our movement. It builds and deepens shared commitments. So we all know, you have like a shared experience with somebody, you go on a fun trip, you have some kind of event where you're very emotionally invested, or you just have fun with a group of people. And it really deepens your commitment to not just the cause that you're all working on, but that group of people specifically. And that's what keeps you involved and engaged in the work of climate justice. Like I said, we power map through these meetings. We figure out, who's calling the shots. Sometimes in a community, it'll be somebody who's been around for 30 years and knows everybody, or used to babysit the kids down the street, and they know all of the secrets and all of the histories and all of the ways that other people have come in and tried to organize a particular community, and if they've been successful or not. And it has many iterations as there are people and cultures. So, we don't want to think of, yes, we have an order of the way we do things. We meet somebody, we have a one-on-one, we organize potentially a group meeting when we've had a lot of one-on-ones, but it can have as many iterations. It doesn't have to be linear. You can have a group meeting, then go back to having more one-on-ones because you've discovered that there's a few folks that you should connect with more individually. And within a specific community, there may be different cultures that you're trying to tap into. And so you want to make sure that the kind of group meetings that you're having are responsive to that. So it can take many forms. It can have as many timelines as you feel is necessary to really build your base in your community. Next slide, please. So when you think about the group meeting, there's two forms. There's the one that's organized by a member or a contact. So those of you that are members or leaders in your community, this is usually a follow-up to a bunch of one-on-ones that you've had, or folks that you have already in your network where you're asking them, like, who else do you know? Can we have a big group meeting? If we have this event, can you invite them? The other form of a group meeting is organized by the organizer or staff member. So it's a little bit more intentional and done in a way that you're really trying to bring specific folks to the table. So you potentially have done some outreach with community groups, and you want to invite a much more bigger variety of stakeholders. And so that meeting would be organized by potentially a staff member or somebody who's dedicating a little bit more time of their day to that ground truthing and base building work. Next slide. So the member is really the connector between the community members and mothers out front. The big reason we center our members so much is because you live in your communities. You have the lived experience of the moms in your communities. And there's absolutely no other way to organize, in my mind, than to bring to the table the folks that have the lived experience of the folks that we're trying to reach, or are able to find bridges to those people. I know a lot of communities, there's barriers between people, and folks are segregated in silos. But I think at the end of the day, being geographically based in a place, being of a place, is really the best way to understand what your specific community needs and wants to accomplish. Next slide, please. And then the organizer, like I said, it's a much more intentional approach, in the sense that those of us that are doing this full time can really support and add to your efforts of building relationships with the folks around you by spending more of our time connecting with organizations, with coalitions, with sort of the larger groups that may take a little bit more handholding to bring those into our movement, and then connect them with everybody that you're working with. Next slide. So one size does not fit all. As I said, group meetings can take as many different forms as the people you're organizing with. So some guidelines to follow for group meetings. We want to replace an activity that they're already engaged in. So maybe throwing a house party is something that folks aren't used to doing. Going to somebody's house they may not know, it may not be a comfortable situation for them, but everybody cooks dinner for their family at some point, right? Or gets dinner ready. So why not organize an event where you're cooking dinner together, or you're doing something, this is again in a hypothetical post-COVID world, or you can replace these with, online versions of it. But doing an activity that people are already doing, taking their kids to a community concert on a weekend, things that feel complementary to people's schedules, that isn't a big ask for really busy moms. We want to
5
remove
minutes.
remove barriers to participation. So we want to make sure that folks have transportation, that there's reimbursement if we're going out for meals, that there's the timing of the event works for folks. If they have young kids and we're doing it right at bedtime, is that going to be conducive for them attending? We want to make sure that we're paying attention to language barriers. Is there anything else? I have a prompt to ask you guys if you can think of any other barriers you've encountered in your organizing that we haven't listed. And you can just use the chat if you don't want to speak up. Transportation. Childcare, that's a big one. I can't believe I didn't mention that. Time, of course, yes. Mobility, that's a good point. Absolutely. We want to think about the spaces where we're convening folks and how accessible they are. These are all great. And then town demographics, safety, translation. Yes, all of them really great. We want to meet somewhere convenient and familiar. That can also be a barrier. If you're having a meeting in a space in a part of town people aren't comfortable going to because of whatever history the community has. A good example is I was organizing before I lived on the farm that I live on now in central New York. I lived in Queens, New York, and was organizing 1 minute left. Oh my goodness. I was living in Western Queens, and there was all these sort of unspoken geographic divisions in parts of the neighborhood where some folks would not go to a different part of even the same housing development. And I had to discover that in order to understand why people from the other side weren't coming to our meetings. So really thinking about, it could be very small things that aren't obvious. And then we want to be culturally responsive as well, of course. During the meeting, we want to, at some point, there's a very formal presentation that we use for house parties. For more informal events, you still want to find a time to have a captive audience, to introduce Mothers Out Front. You want to locate Mothers Out Front within the larger context of the movement. So we're not just an organization of moms fighting for climate justice. We're part of a global climate movement. We're part of a movement of human beings, kids, grandparents, everybody who cares about living in a sustainable environment in the future. And so you really want to ground folks in this idea that what we're doing is a really important small piece of this larger puzzle. We want to provide tangible ways to get involved. So at this point, you've had some one-on-one meetings with people, you're doing this group meeting, and you want to make sure that the people you've already spoken to several times about what Mothers Out Front is now have ways for them to continue to stay involved. You want to make sure you have all their contact information. And you want to involve folks in conversation. So not just presenting to them, but really making sure that you're constantly having this back and forth with them to, as you tell them about Mothers Out Front, you're discovering what their passions are and why they showed up at that event, what brought them there, what is their story, what is their motivation. You want to stay away from jargon, exclusive ways of talking. We use a lot of wonky language in the climate world. It can be really difficult to engage people that aren't necessarily up to speed. So we want to make sure that we're, explaining things really simply and really leaning on who we are as moms and grandparents and caretakers and stakeholders in this movement to tell our personal story, why we care and why we're there. And we want to make an ask. So that could be anything from, I'm having another one of these, come back, or we're having, this is a campaign action next week. I would love for you to be involved. So making sure that you're not just letting folks walk out the door without their next task. I see it's really hard for me to keep up with the chat. If somebody could.
So I was asking if there are other models other than house parties that are not very formal that people have tried and had success with.
Yes, so that's actually a really perfect segue to our next piece. So I'll turn it back to Sheila. We have two stories. Sheila's going to share hers and I'll share mine of work we've done in organizing before we came to Mothers Out Front in ways that are maybe outside the box of how we've been thinking about group meetings here. Sheila, you're muted.
Don't you love when you find you're muted and you've been talking to yourself for a minute? I was just saying there are some great ones in the chat and we'll continue throughout this training getting more ideas from you. So as Tatiana said, I'm going to go into just an example of not a house meeting that I used when organizing for SEIU, Service International Union, I was representing janitors at the Denver International Airport, and particularly in this case, parking attendants. And it was a very, I mean, my heart just swells thinking about it, and just why, one of the many reasons why organizing across race and class is just so beautiful and so important and so empowering. So this was a group of union membership. I can't remember, the number. It was close to 1,000 people probably, that had traditionally been, white and Black, US born, and a lot of our stewards had been around for 10, 20 years who represented that group of people. But it had actually changed to be majority Ethiopian and Eritrean over the last, whatever amount of time. And so now there was this huge division and distrust between our members, somewhat based on cultural background and just not necessarily knowing each other as well. And the stewards were representing this American-born group, whereas the majority of our membership was now Ethiopian and Eritrean in this bargaining unit. And we were coming up on bargaining, and it was just very clear we were going to lose in this contract fight, everything that we needed to fight for if we weren't unified. And so this was an example of pulling together different groups so that we could be stronger in the face of bargaining. And the way that I did it as their organizer was the group meeting. I mean, it was the snowflake model, which a lot of you probably know from organizing. So first I held one-on-ones with a lot of our leaders in both of those two groups and just talked about, the importance of this upcoming bargaining, of being unified. Like, the next ask was, who else do you know that you could invite to meet with me? And it was building trust with the union too, because there had been a lot of people not being involved in the union, not necessarily trusting the unions. We needed to build that trust with us as well. And then that got kind of snowballed out into our group meetings. So if you want to go to the next slide, these are some more pictures from our group meetings that eventually came out of it. And the group meeting, it was really interesting because the reason I feel like it's a good example here was the way that it really fit well with the Ethiopian and Eritrean culture. Coffee is central to their culture. In very traditional towns in Ethiopia, there's 3 different coffee ceremonies throughout the day. It's like the center of the community. People come together, they do their socializing, political conversations, organizing. There's deep, deep organizing history in Ethiopia and Eritrea. I mean, blows your minds the kind of organizing that people have done there, the more I learned about it. And so meeting around coffee made a lot of sense. But of course, we're in Denver in 2000 whatever. And so it was Starbucks. And it was the Starbucks that was on the way home on their bus route. Most people took the bus from their job. And so we just built out that snowflake model. Some of these people are stewards. Some of these people are folks who have never been involved before. And it was just really ironing out the communication, the trust, like what was going on at the bargaining table, what did people want from our union membership. And we were able to really come together, and instead of being disengaged, more just hoping that the management would give people what, you know, they deserved, they fought for it together. And we did some pretty incredible actions and won, you know, great pieces of that contract that I am positive would not have been won without the unity that was created through this model. So this model, again, is, you know, reaching out to people, holding a one-on-one meeting, asking them to bring someone else, and then pulling everybody back together. And so that's my story to share of something that may be a little different than what we've seen at Mothers Out Front, with house meetings being just like the cookie cutter mold of how to do a group meeting. And I will pass it on to Tatiana now for another example.
Great, thank you. So as I mentioned, spent many years in Western Queens, and did got most of my organizing chops in that neighborhood, and have a lot of just warmth and connection to it forever, I think. Western Queens is a very interesting place. It is the kind of intersection of so many different cultures and races and classes. The part that I was organizing specifically was home to Queensbridge, which is the largest public housing development in the country. There's about 9,000 people, and that's on record. It's probably about double that because people live in multi-generational homes. There's also several other public housing developments, along with very affluent pockets of new development and high rises, and then also really traditional kind of more like many generations old Queens residents who've been there for a long time in parts of Astoria. And so lots of different constituencies. And at the time I was working for an organization called City Harvest, and it was organizing around food justice. And this was a part of New York City that was really disproportionately affected by inequitable access to healthy food. And so we wanted to really go into this community, figure out what were the barriers, what were the issues, why was access to good, healthy food so much worse in pockets of this community than, you know, even blocks away. In New York City, neighborhoods change within blocks, and the reality and the resources you have access to change so rapidly and so quickly, and are very determined by geography. And I, as an organizer at the time, you know, was living not far from the very western parts of this community, but, you know, didn't grow up there. I did not have the lived experience of someone who was living in Queensbridge houses, who had dealt with no access to anything but a bodega and rotten vegetables their whole life. And so I knew that I needed a very authentic and responsive approach to how I was going to get to know people. And so I got together with, I think it was just 3 of us in the beginning. I had sort of started reaching out to community organizations and asking folks who was interested in food justice. And they connected me to a few folks, and we got together and we decided that we were going to roll out a series of potluck meals. And we were going to host them in different spaces throughout the community. We were going to host one at the local Arts Center. We're going to host one at the community center within Queensbridge houses. We're going to host one in an outdoor space. And we asked everybody to come with a small dish to share, and really just said, you know, come have dinner with your family, bring your kids. It's, you know, on a weekday, it's free for everybody. It's free to attend. And, you know, all got together. We had food, we had drinks, and started to slowly through these dinners have conversations about things like, you know, why do you think the stores around here are so much worse than the stores down the block? Why are there no farmers markets? What are the issues? Why aren't you eating healthy fruits and vegetables? What would make a difference for you to be able to do that more? And we must have done, I think, a year of these potluck dinners before we even made any decisions about how we were going to organize or what issues we were going to work on. It was basically this really intentional, community-driven listening tour where every single dinner that we would do, we would learn more, and we would get recommendations of who else we should invite the next time. Where else could we host one of these events where we could reach more people? And as you see in this picture, this is kind of towards the end of that process where we really had an engaged group of people, and we had started to come up with some identity, which became the Queens Action Council, and started to come up with a community calendar and events that we wanted to do. I do want to quickly share my screen and show you guys some more pictures. Yeah. So this is, we had a Facebook page, and we, which was how at the time, this was 2009 to 2013, roughly 2014. Facebook was really the medium with how we communicated with our community. We started this page, we invited people to like it, and we shared all our events and our photographs, and it sort of still lives in the archive of all the things that we did. I don't know how to advance. Oh, there it is. So as you can see, this is a photo of us in a library in a community center at Ravenswood Houses. That's me. This is us in the basement of a children's center. This wasn't a dinner. This was kind of a meeting that we had after we had already really built our core team. And as you can see, we always really shared with the rest of the community all the things that we had discussed and talked about and decided to work on. And so if somebody who hadn't come to a meeting was like, oh, I care about CSAs, or I really want to bring a fresh food box program to our community, they could get engaged and be like, I should really come to the next meeting. We did planting events with kids. We did a big food assessment where I actually, with City Harvest, wrote a big report on the state of the food system in Queens, given of all the conversations that we had had to generate more funding and more attention to the issue. We did a big Queens Food Day where we just hosted an event in the park, and thousands of people came and tried food and healthy recipes, and we gave out pumpkins and apples to kids. I mean, there's just, it's not going forward, but there's just all sorts of examples of the different activities we were able to do just by spending some time having dinner with folks. And so, I'm a huge food person. I'll always advocate for dinner, but I just, even in practice as an organizer, to me, doing something that people were already doing in their own communities and their families, but doing it together with folks that they may have not had a chance to speak to before, it was dinner first, but it generated so much rich conversation and understanding and knowledge sharing about the food system in that community. It really created the trust and the relationships to then have not only continue to build our group and have people come back and be interested, but really build the trust we needed to get to understand what we needed to do, to really be effective and choose the solutions that would be most resonant to people who have lived experience in that community. This is a tour we did on a rooftop farm in Queens. So we did a lot of field trips for different parts of the group eventually. I'll stop sharing because I know I'm probably out of time. There's so much more I can say. It was, I don't think I've ever had such a transformational community experience as I did in Queens. And I still talk to all those folks on a daily, not on a daily basis, but on a regular basis, and they will forever be my family. And if I hadn't, I think, I was working for a very large organization that at the time was kind of going into communities and just doing what they wanted because they had money and they could. And if I hadn't been given the time and the kind of freedom to really build these sort of authentic connections, we would have just been spending money running programs and campaigns that were not effective and not responsive to the needs and the history of that specific community. Do we have some time for questions? I'll open it up. If anybody's any questions about what I just talked about or Sheila's example.
We might, Margaret, we have like maybe a minute or something?
Yeah, we have like a minute or so, and then we're breaking out into groups.
I wanted to just ask about, being a union organizer, there's obvious common concern. What kinds of mothers out front common concerns? I mean, are people worried about fossil fuels? I mean, how do we get across that common concern? I think the food thing is fabulous. We were actually trying to do Healthy Soils food system stuff in Mass, but isn't that really kind of a huge difference between the organizing that you guys did versus what we have to do?
I guess the way I see it, no. And I've worked in community organizations, that are nonprofit. I've worked in unions, and I think when you get down to it, like, absolutely, I think we know that environmental issues affect everybody, and that there are communities, there are BIPOC communities, there are poor communities, there are rich communities, there are white communities that all feel touched by this. And I think that's the concept here, is like uncovering the networks that already exist and the people who already are either already aware of and interested on this topic, or agitating them around it, which is something we don't talk about perhaps as much as I'm used to at Mothers Out Front. But, agitation and organizing is the idea that, as you're talking about an issue, you're getting people to think about it and get angry about it and to get in touch with their emotions around it, but not just to let them down, to then provide hope and a pathway to get involved in something bigger than themselves. And so I see that being very much the same here as at a union as anywhere else. And I'd be happy to talk about that. Maybe not in this 1 minute of our training, but.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, for me, it's all a hearts and mind issue. Like, not everybody who came to join us for dinner came back, because they were like, I don't really want to work on food justice in this community. It was nice having dinner with you. That's still a relationship that we built. That's still somebody who is part of our larger movement because we've met them. And I think, with moms and with climate justice, to me, it's really just the emotional connection. You're building the relationship first. And through these activities, these group meetings, you're building common ground and solidarity with other folks in your community. The issue, not that it's secondary, but the issue isn't, you're in the room to build a relationship, to build a connection, to share an experience. And then you get to the issues. And so many of the ways that, I just saw a comment about how there's no action that's obvious. There sometimes isn't, but through kind of the process of building the relationship, you discover the ways that, maybe you can move on an issue you didn't think was obvious because you haven't had a chance to speak to somebody about it, or you haven't had a chance to sort of develop it and be in a community setting around it. So, I think what I would say from my experience is really focus on the relationship building piece and the connective tissue piece. And everything else will be emergent out of that, because somebody's coming to meet with you around this issue, they're already a little bit interested. It's just about unraveling what that is and how you can turn it into action.
Yeah, let's move to the next slide, just in the interest of time. And I think this one is you too, Tatiana, right?
Yeah, sorry. So we're going to go into breakout rooms, and you're going to speak with your team and your other members, and you want to brainstorm some new ways that you could utilize group meetings to roll your snowball and to build momentum for your base building after your initial one-on-one. So it could be some of the ways we've talked about today. It could be some of the ways that sort of have come to you as you've been listening to us speak. And I believe Shauna will break us out.
Welcome back, everybody. So we're going to spend a few minutes now. We are going to finish a little after 9. I apologize. I was not honest, apparently, but not too much after. Just hearing from a couple of groups, what you're going to be doing now. What are some ideas for group meetings that maybe you have that are different from what you've done in the past? And unmute and share out verbally. I'm really excited to hear.
One idea that Linda and I were discussing was doing brunch at the park. but it could be potluck, and so people can just bring whatever. And then because our groups in San Francisco are so kind of predetermined, asking people to bring a friend or bring another family. So you're still coming and hanging out just like you would with another family at the park, because post-pandemic, everyone does park hangouts. And it can be at a playground or a park. And so that was our idea of trying something new.
Awesome, thank you. And I do want to acknowledge, we can actually close out the slide just for this part, Janet, so we could all see each other's faces, you know, that we're talking about in-person organizing, which may not be possible very soon or even right now, depending on where you are and comfort levels. So,
Right.
you know, we're talking about these things, but it's also a changing world. So I just want to acknowledge that. But thank you, Lavanya. And would anyone else like to share something that they came up with in their group?
I think we're going to have to keep doing things to a great extent remotely for a while, and folks in the community seem to be pretty comfortable with that. So we're really trying to think of varieties of things that we can do remotely, or if we do have in-person events, it's likely that there'll be, we have one thing Pueblo has that's really nice is a lot of parks. And so we may try and organize like some films in the park, or conversations in the park, where we can socially distance. It'll be warm here for a long time yet. And in fact, right now, it's the middle of the day, and even into the early evening is too hot for a lot of people. So, you know, 90s, low hundreds. Don't believe that about it being a dry heat. It's still hot. And so, like walking into a pizza oven. But that's how we're thinking.
Wow. And it looks like you had the same idea as Sarah from Ipswich, IPSMA. She mentioned having a brunch at the park is great. And then someone else said, yeah, you can get the kids out and gives them something to do before it gets hot. I also see Linda says your films are good and they work online. Yeah, that's great. So
And
please,
something, oh,
go ahead, Velma.
oh, I was just going to say one thing that we have very actively here is and I really was relating to Tatiana's presentation. We have a very active and extraordinarily well organized food scarcity, local foods organization here in town, and there are a number of groups that do food distributions in town. And so we have been able to participate. We haven't done it as a group meeting yet, but we've been able to participate with some of those events, community cleanups and food distributions as a community resource fair. And it occurs to me that might be something that could be paired with a small group meeting either before or during the event. Maybe afterwards, people tend to be tired, but.
Yeah, that's a great idea, pairing your group meeting with something else that's already going on that's meaningful to your group, the people in your group. So thank you. We'll go to the last few slides here and then close out for the night. So thank you for all of your sharing and participation. It's been really nice to meet some of those out front members and hear what you're up to, and hopefully, you know, help provide some new ways of thinking about what you're up to as well. So we can go to the next slide.
All right, so these are some other examples, some of which you've already mentioned. Anything can be a group meeting if you're doing it in a group. It could be a group outing to build relationships. So you could go to a block party. You can go on a hike together. You can have a picnic. You can garden together. One of the best ways to build relationships and have conversations is to keep your hands busy, right? So gardening day, neighborhood cleanups. I heard a few people mention kids activities. So making it really family friendly and you get the kids to do something together and then you're able to have conversations. Organized community climate action days. So having, going to a park and organizing a bunch of different activities for different members of the family that can be both fun and educational about climate or environmental issues in your specific place. You could cook dinner for your kids together. So if you are comfortable with having somebody, group over at your house, you can all come together, you can cook together. Your kids are fed for the night and you can use that time to have a conversation. Hosting another event within a house, but maybe making it more casual than a standard house party. So no presentation necessarily, but doing, maybe a cookout or a barbecue, and having more informal conversations with folks where you're sharing information about Mothers Out Front, but it's more interactive as opposed to you presenting. And the goal of all of this is really to build solidarity and relationships. So we don't want people to feel like they're coming to an event where you're selling and pitching them something transactional at the end. You want to use all of these as opportunities to build relationships. Next slide. Sheila's going to wrap it up.
All right, so we're just wrapping up here. For all of you who have been with us throughout the whole series, I hope that you feel like you got something in and that it connects, kind of a thread through each piece of why it's so important to base build and then how to do that, how to really roll your snowball and build out your snowflake and, whatever words we're going to use to describe building that base and going deeper and then continuing to grow the people that we have involved in this movement together across race and class. So just chat in, what's a tangible action your team will take to build your base across race and class after taking this series? Or that you would like to explore, just to make it a little less scary. What's something you'd like to explore? Doing a family-friendly outdoor event on the east side of San Jose, maybe tree planting. Yes to gathering and all that we can save. Go to the community rather than have them come to us, meet and not sell our campaign, absolutely. More relationship building activities. I think a key thread is the idea of listening, finding ways to get together and build relationships through deep listening, the one-to-one. Socially distanced family beach cleanup event till October and then brunch at the park near the farmer's market. Awesome. I plan to take some of these exciting outdoor gathering ideas to my team, connect better with school green groups and other community environmental groups. So we'll let that chat keep going if there are any others there. This is really exciting to hear some tangible takeaways that you all have. So thank you for sharing and sharing this time with us. So we can go to the last slide, I believe. And just like all the other trainings, if you could please fill out the eval form that will be dropped into the chat in a minute here. Also, if you would like to donate or become a member of Mothers Out Front, that will be dropped into the chat. And I believe there was a request for people to stay on for another 15 minutes who just want to get to know each other across teams. Why don't you just raise your hand if you think you would like to do that so we can see how many people there are. And if we actually need to do breakout rooms, or I see like 4 hands, so maybe we'll just keep everybody in the same big room. So thanks everyone, and it's been great spending this time together. Thanks to all of you for being here.